My name is Gary Zhang. I'm an artist and writer who's currently based at MIT. And in my work, I'm interested in socio-technical systems. And by this, I mean thinking about technologies in terms of techniques of revealing the world and techniques of being in it. So we can think, for example, not so much of cell phones and cars, but also of geometry, perspective, or writing as technologies which have fundamentally changed the way in which we relate to the world, and historically in different cultures shifted and privileged certain relations over others. So, for example, Socrates was probably the first Luddite. He was very worried that the technology of writing would spread over ancient Greece, and all the young men of Athens would forget how to remember their poetry. You might, if you're an architect, you might recognize this guy. He's a kind of a notorious guy. He's Robert Moses. He's an urban planner in the early 20th century in New York. And he's responsible for many of the highway projects that connected Manhattan, New York City, and the surrounding areas. He's especially famous for connecting up New York City and Long Island. And at the time, he effectively created those suburbs that exist there now. But when he connected these areas, he made the bridges just a little bit too low, so the buses can't pass through them. And so this meant that if you were poor and if you had to rely on public transport and you didn't own a car, you would be unable to make it to Long Island, at least unless you walked or something. And as it happened, the people who didn't have a car were mostly poor and black. And so this kind of quite pernicious but banal design of infrastructure happens all around us today. And Long Island is today still a very wealthy and white community. So I bring this up to think about the idea that infrastructure and infrastructural design is always also the design of social relations. So this kind of brings me on to the bigger theme, the more contemporary theme I want to talk about, which is blockchain. So you probably have heard of blockchain, but it's kind of a complex and dense system. If you ask a software engineer, blockchain is a distributed ledger technology for Bitcoin, which is a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, which is not super helpful, but extremely accurate. But if you look at the wider phenomenon around blockchain, you realize it's kind of a socio-technical system par excellence. It's, for example, here you have what Buddhists are launching a digital currency to banish corruption. Blockchain is sending ex-NBA star Dennis Rodman to North Korea on an international diplomacy mission. And Bitcoin mining, more seriously, is costing more electricity than Ireland. And that was this year. I think this year has been upgraded to Austria, and soon it will probably be somewhere slightly bigger. So what was it about this technology that could bring together all of these different narratives? And it's a pretty weird situation. And so for a while, I attended MIT's Bitcoin Club. This is like an undergraduate society at any university, except it's MIT, so it's maybe the people are slightly more intense. They made cupcakes. This is the Bitcoin symbol. But at this club, it wasn't only the super smart undergraduates who were doing a lot of the work. It drew together this incredible range of people. An incredible range of mostly middle-aged men, but different kinds. So we had like bankers, we had kind of activists, we had like libertarians, kind of socialists, high school teachers who were obsessed with the fourth industrial revolution and thought like the singularity was about to come. These kind of like lots of people just came off the streets to be in this room. And there were some more serious people as well. There were like lawyers, and there were people from the Navy who come to study Bitcoin blockchain research. And they'd come to join the club of a bunch of 19-year-olds on a Tuesday night in a cold Boston seminar room. So what was it about this technology that could bring together all of these people into one room, all these people who would never usually share a room together and would probably never wish to? So I realized that there were two key reasons. One is about trust. So blockchain promises to transform one of our very fundamental social currencies, which is trust. And all of these people in some way had become disillusioned, probably rightly so, in a way that we all a bit are now, with the kinds of social institutions that form our societies. So blockchain promises to kind of automate a lot of this trust process and promises to change technologies like banking and other infrastructures. The other reason is hype. Blockchain has an extraordinary amount of hype around it. In fact, the reason I got into it was because I thought I'd get rich. I did not get rich. Everyone had the same idea at the same time. We made a huge bubble. It went. But if you look at any good Ponzi scheme, you can learn a lot about the society and the desires and the ideas around society and technology that are built into it. So to understand this kind of whole trust structure, it's good to go back a little bit. You probably recognize this from school. It's Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the frontispiece to his book, which was one of the first theories of the social contract, at least in the West. So his idea was that society needed some kind of monarchic or theological structure to keep it together in place, to keep everyone, it's that kind of that saying, like a place for every man and every man in his place. So he thought that we needed a strong autocratic hierarchy in order for anything to become productive. Otherwise, we would fall into what he called the state of nature, which is this very romantic idea that we were all like cavemen and we're killing each other and no one will make anything nice and we will never develop. But the basic idea of the social contract exists across many different spheres and histories. Of course, we recognize today we have this idea of global capitalism, which emerged from the West, is now taking over everything, which is to say that somehow with enough free individuals and free markets, we can ensure some kind of set of interdependencies that ensures we don't kill each other. Elsewhere, even in the animal kingdom, you could arguably apply this framework, where there's this evolutionary this co-evolution of relationships between species which maintain them in relatively stable networks. And within these societies, you have mechanisms. You could think of them as social technologies. For example, some societies are more based around shame, others more based around guilt. As a generalization, but these structures and these mechanisms keep the structures enforced, and they keep reproducing certain ways of being. And we call all of this together something like a social contract or something like a set of cultural institutions, which are sometimes unique to different places. But blockchain basically promises to automate a lot of this. The idea is that maybe we can just do it all with software. So what a blockchain is, in brief, it's basically an electronic account book. So every transaction that's ever happened sits in a big book, a digital book, and it's completely immutable. It's not changeable. And then, but instead of having your bank look after these accounts and manage everyone's money, you distribute this to everybody. So everybody can verify what has happened. You can sort of verify every transaction in history. And what this allows you to do is to, well, every time you add a block to the chain, every time you add a set of transactions, you spend a vast amount of energy. And this idea is that because if anyone wanted to cheat the system in order to go back in its history and change something and say, I didn't pay you $500, then they have to spend more energy than the rest of the network combined at a faster rate. Because this energy is spent in terms of calculating big math sums and doing very intense but wasteful computation, it's almost technically impossible and highly unfeasible for anyone to corrupt the system, which is why it's considered secure by consensus. So basically, instead of building trust within the system, blockchain proposes a kind of social infrastructure which makes cheating impossible. So what interested me here was the relationship it formed almost materially between heat and trust, between a material computational resource and something much more ethereal, something we think about it in terms of a set of social relationships and as almost a philosophical thing that we've developed over time called the social contract. So I wanted to build a project that kind of explored this transformation of energies across different domains. So this is the first iteration of a project called Farm. And what's going on is, on this side, you have a computer mining Bitcoin, and it produces a vast amount of heat as well as exchange value. And the computer is submerged in a tank of oil. And the oil is there to transfer the heat away from the computer so it can be harnessed for other uses. And on the other side, you have a colony of tropical shrimp. Tropical shrimp and algae exist in this closed ecosystem where they can reproduce forever as long as there's light. But they also need warm temperatures. So I wanted to create a system that used the excess heat from blockchain to sustain another living system. And they kind of exist parasitically off each other as a cooling system and a heating system. I decided to take this kind of energy transformation to a slightly larger context, and I built an installation in the gallery, which is essentially the same idea. This is the computer. This is the computer running under oil. It's making very hot oil. And then the pumps are taking the oil up into tubes and going all around the room for about 200 feet until they create this make the room into this almost giant organ with a big circulatory system. And so the tubes are full of hot oil, and they're acting as a radiator as well as a cooling system for the computer. There are the tubes. And so as the audience members enter the room, they feel this palpable change in temperature by 2 or 3 degrees, and they kind of enter into the metabolism of this technical system. So these are really experiments. I mean, I'm not really proposing a functional solution to any particular problem here. But what this allows us to think about is the socio-technical dynamics within, and material and energetic dynamics within a system like blockchain. Because blockchain is essentially a kind of engineer's paradigm. It's a clever engineer's idea, but it's also quite antisocial. It says, let's not talk to each other, let's not do the hard work we call politics. Let's just consider society as a technical problem and build a piece of software that can fit us all into it in order to make sure that no one cheats. But at the same time, if you look at a system like blockchain, you kind of reveal a lot of the ideas of how we want to build social institutions within an increasingly networked world, with a world which is increasingly running on informatic processes. So I would propose that blockchain is not, at the moment, a particularly useful product, but it is a massive step in cryptography that allows us to think about how we want to relate to each other in a very networked future. To end, I'm going to show you one other project I made. This is called Proof of Stake. And essentially, I channeled the heat from the mining computer into a water bath to make a sous vide cooker, which cooked a nice piece of meat. And then I fried up the meat and I ate it, and it was very tasty. And I would argue this is probably the first socially useful implementation of the blockchain to date. Thank you.